I've always loved driving at night. There's something about the way the world falls silent, how the road ahead becomes a mystery, carved out of darkness by the thin beams of your headlights. But that night, as I turned onto the desolate highway cutting through the woods, I felt a prickling unease crawl up my spine. The night seemed heavier than usual, the darkness thicker, swallowing the trees into an endless abyss. My only company was the hum of the engine and the faint static of a forgotten radio station. That's when I saw it. A car parked on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking erratically. A black sedan, old and beat up, its windows impossibly dark. I slowed down, my instincts screaming at me to keep driving, but the good Samaritan in me forced my foot onto the brake. I rolled down my window and called out, "Hey, you okay?" No response. The car looked abandoned. The hood wasn't popped, and there were no signs of distress. No broken glass, no flat tires. But as I studied the vehicle, I noticed something odd. The driver's door was slightly ajar, swinging just enough to create a rhythmic creak in the still night. I felt a chill. Every part of me wanted to leave, but before I could hit the gas, I heard it. A faint muffled sound, a cry for help. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. A muffled plea coming from somewhere near the sedan. My heart thudded in my chest as I strained to see through the darkness. The cry came again, weaker this time, but it was enough to pull me out of the car. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Its beam sliced through the blackness as I cautiously approached the sedan. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Silence. The sedan loomed before me, its matte black paint absorbing the faint glow of my flashlight. I shone the beam into the cracked open driver's door, expecting to find someone slumped over, but the seat was empty. The faint smell of something metallic wafted out. Blood, maybe? Then I heard the cry again, closer now, coming from the trees beyond the road. I froze. My instincts screamed to run, to drive away and never look back, but I couldn't. The sound was too human, too desperate to ignore. Against every ounce of better judgment, I stepped off the asphalt and into the woods, the beam of my phone's light trembling as badly as my hands. The cries grew louder, like someone choking back sobs. My feet crunched against the underbrush, every step echoing louder than it should. "Where are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. And then I saw it. A woman, kneeling in the dirt, her back to me, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her long matted hair clung to her face and neck, as if it hadn't seen water in weeks. Her hands were clutching at her stomach like she was in pain. "Ma'am?" I called out, my flashlight trained on her. She froze, her whole body going rigid. The air felt charged, electric, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, she began to turn her head toward me. And that's when I saw her face. It wasn't just pale, it was wrong. Her eyes were wide, too wide, stretching unnaturally toward her temples. Her mouth hung open, slack and hollow, as though it had forgotten how to close. But it was her skin that truly made my blood run cold. It wasn't just pale. It shimmered faintly, like something wet and slimy was crawling beneath the surface. She locked eyes with me, her lips stretched into an unnatural grin. "Help me," she croaked, her voice garbled like a distorted recording. I stumbled backward, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. My gut screamed that whatever I was looking at wasn't human. And then she stood up, fluid and jerky all at once, her movements like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Before I could react, she lunged. I barely managed to stumble out of her way, crashing backward into a tree. My flashlight clattered to the ground, the beam spinning wildly across the forest floor. In its chaotic light, I saw her. No, it. That thing wasn't human. Not anymore. Her limbs twitched as she turned, her head snapping unnaturally fast to face me. Her grin stretched wider than it should have been possible, exposing jagged, discolored teeth. She took a step toward me, her movements sharp and disjointed, as though her body was breaking and resetting with each motion. "Help me," she croaked again, her voice warping. It was no longer a plea, it was a taunt. I scrambled to my feet, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Stay back," I shouted, though my voice broke halfway through. I snatched up my flashlight and pointed it at her face. She recoiled slightly, her skin glistening like it was coated in oil. But then she laughed, a low, guttural sound that made my stomach churn. "You can't leave," she hissed, her voice splintering into two tones, one high-pitched and childlike, the other deep and monstrous. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of leaves behind me. I spun around, my light catching glimpses of movement in the darkness, shapes, figures, too many to count, all creeping toward me, their glowing eyes reflecting the beam like a pack of predators. They moved with the same jerky, unnatural rhythm as the woman, their bodies bending and contorting in ways that defied logic. I didn't wait to see what they wanted. I bolted. My feet pounded against the forest floor, and my lungs burned as branches clawed at my face and arms. The cries of "help me" followed me, each one overlapping with the other, growing louder and more distorted. Then the sound shifted. It wasn't coming from behind me anymore. It was coming from ahead. I skidded to a stop, nearly losing my balance. My flashlight beam landed on a figure standing in the middle of the path. It was the woman, or something that looked like her. But it couldn't have been. She had been behind me, and there was no way she could have gotten here so fast. She tilted her head, her two wide eyes glinting. "Help me," she whispered, her mouth curling into that grotesque grin again. I backed away, only to feel a cold, slimy hand wrap around my wrist. I turned, and one of the figures was right there, its empty eyes staring into mine. Its grip tightened, unnaturally strong, and I could feel something wet and warm oozing onto my skin. I screamed, twisting and thrashing, but it wouldn't let go. Then, out of sheer instinct, or maybe blind panic, I swung the flashlight as hard as I could. The beam shattered as it connected with the thing's head, but the force was enough to make it release me. I didn't look back. I ran. I tore through the woods, blind now without the flashlight. My only guide was the faint glow of the highway in the distance, a sliver of salvation against the encroaching dark. My breath came in ragged gasps, my pulse pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. Except for them. Their voices followed me, echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Help me." The words grew more distorted, splitting and overlapping, a chorus of desperate wails and mocking jeers. I didn't dare look back, though I could feel them closing in, their presence like ice crawling up my spine. I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the asphalt, falling hard onto my knees. The impact jarred my body, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the searing pain in my legs, and sprinted toward my car. It was still there, thank God. But as I got closer, my heart sank. The driver's side door was open, the interior light casting a sickly yellow glow on the empty seat. I yanked the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut behind me. My hands fumbled for the keys, but they weren't in the ignition. I frantically patted my pockets, praying I hadn't lost them in the woods. My fingers closed around the familiar shape, and I pulled them out, shoving them into the ignition with trembling hands. Behind the car, the darkness began to move. Figures emerged from the trees, their twisted bodies illuminated by the taillights. They didn't run. They didn't need to. They knew they had me. I turned the key. The engine sputtered. "No, no, come on," I yelled, twisting the key again. The engine roared to life just as one of them reached the car. Its hand slapped against the window, leaving a smear of that oily, glistening substance. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as I shot down the highway. But they didn't stop. In the rearview mirror, I could see them, running faster than anything humans should, their bodies bending and snapping unnaturally as they pursued me. Their glowing eyes burned into my soul. The road ahead blurred as I pushed the car to its limits. The speedometer climbed higher, the engine roaring in protest. The figures began to fade in the mirror, but their voices didn't. "Help me." I clenched my teeth, refusing to look back. Eventually, the voices grew faint, swallowed by the roar of the wind and the hum of the tires. I didn't stop driving until I reached the first sign of civilization, an all-night gas station with flickering neon lights. I pulled in, threw the car into park, and stumbled out, my legs barely able to support me. The attendant looked up from his magazine, his face twisting into concern. "You okay, buddy?" I couldn't speak. My throat was raw, my mind racing. I just nodded, trying to steady my breathing. As I leaned against the car, I glanced back down the highway, half expecting to see them standing there, watching me. But the road was empty, bathed in the cold light of the gas station. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night. Who would believe me? But I'll never forget the way their eyes glowed in the darkness, or the way their voices echoed in my head long after I escaped. Now, every time I drive at night, I keep my doors locked, my windows up, and my eyes on the road. And when I see a car parked on the shoulder, no matter how desperate it looks, I don't stop. Because I know what's out there, and I know they're still waiting.